right now across Australia, we have between 800,000 and 1 million prescribed cannabis patients.
More pain relief and more toolkits, more tools in their toolkit for pain management.
I'm using it because I wasn't getting enough pain relief from my previous medications, or equally, I was struggling with the side effects from my medication.
And once it had sort of been explained to me and I had the information, I found that more information was easier to find.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special National Pain Week session. My name is Nicolette Ellis and I'm honoured to be your moderator for today's conversation. Medicinal cannabis, research, regulation, and of course the patient voice. This session is proudly sponsored by Lumia Mission. Thank you for your ongoing support in helping us create a space for evidence, lived experience, and open dialogue. Medicinal cannabis is a topic of high interest and sometimes some frustration within the pain community. Although it's been legally available in Australia since 2016, it remains a complex area to navigate. The International Association for the Study of Pain has not yet endorsed medicinal cannabis for general use in pain management, citing a need for more high-quality clinical evidence. Yet many people living with chronic pain report real benefits, while also navigating significant challenges around cost, access, and legal restrictions, particularly when it comes to driving. So how do we make sense of this evolving space where personal experience, scientific evidence, and regulation don't always align? Well, luckily we have an exceptional panel here with us today to help us explore these questions. Let me introduce our speakers. Leading the charge in the patient voice is Holly Crawford. She's a Winter Olympian, a silver medalist in half-pipe snowboarding. Holly is here today to share her personal experience navigating chronic pain and medicinal cannabis. Welcome, Holly.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
And leading the research charge is our Associate Professor, Mike Armour. Mike is a globally respected researcher in women's reproductive health, leading multiple very large-scale clinical trials, including endometriosis, menstrual health, and medicinal cannabis. He comes from the National Institute of Complementary Medicine at Western Sydney University. The biggest thanks for being here today, Mike.
Thanks very much for having me.
And last but not least is Melanie Wenzel. She brings a deep experience in health system reform and policy, which is very much needed in this very complex regulatory environment. And her work is intrinsically driven by a passion for improving care and access for patient outcomes. Welcome, Mel.
Thank you so much for having me and for everything that you and the Chronic Pain Australia team do all year. It's a real privilege.
Thank you, Mel. And I'd also like to highlight that it's very rare we have a panel who also have their own lived experience of chronic pain. I know Holly is leading the charge in this conversation today, but it's exceptional that we have a panelist who so deeply understand what it's like to live with chronic pain. And thank you for being here today. So Mel, let's start with you and kick it off. Medicinal cannabis became legal in Australia in 2016. How common is its use today and who's accessing these treatments?
This is a great question and it's a mystery to so many people out there, but the data is absolutely available. So right now across Australia, we have between 800,000 and 1 million prescribed cannabis patients. That data comes from the TGA and it's publicly available. The reason for the range there is because we actually don't track patients, we track prescriptions. But again, that data can be found easily. That's the start of the story, because then if we look into the chronic pain community and if we have a look at the National Pain Survey from last year, we know that 28% of respondents were currently using medicinal cannabis and that another 38 intended to. So that's 66% of respondents from last year's National Pain Survey who are having the cannabis conversation. We also know from the National Drug Survey that there's around 500,000 Australians accessing cannabis through illicit sources to self-medicate. So it brings in the conversation, yes, we've got maybe up to 1 million people prescribed, but in fact, we've got about 500,000 people using cannabis to manage their pain or their conditions without clinical oversight and without quality control of medicine. So there's a real harm minimisation piece when we talk about those numbers.
And Mel, has it just grown continuously over this period of time since 2016, or is it sort of stagnated in access? Because we've talked about a few of the access issues, so it's kind of surprising how much growth there is in this space.
Yeah, it's not a straight line in terms of the growth over the past kind of 8 years. The first few years were very slow because the prices were very high. There were very little cannabis medicines available in Australia. We really didn't know. The regulators were getting organised and understanding how to manage patient access, which is the role of the TGA, how to manage the medicines themselves, the role of the ODC. And it's taken time for all of that to come together. The last 3 years, there's been exponential growth, and that has come from really the cannabis industry finding ways to connect with patients in a way that meets them where they want to be. So patients are asking, and the industry is finding ways to work with doctors to support them to understand that this can be one tool in a toolkit for managing a condition or a set of symptoms. It's not the only answer, and it's certainly not for everyone. But that kind of broad application has really, really catapulted over the past few years.
And it's certainly a huge topic that we cover in the National Pain Report and each National Pain Survey, because we understand the demand and the issues that are happening for our community around access and costs, and the challenges of even getting into an appointment to see someone to prescribe the medicine. So I wanted to pivot to Holly around this sort of topic and understand a bit more from her around her pain conditions. What kind of led to trialing medicinal cannabis in her treatment plan as a tool in her toolkit?
Hey guys, yeah, look, I was a professional snowboard athlete for 20 years. I've broken most of the bones in my body, torn most of the ligaments. Arthritis is a skip, hop and a jump away in a really great form. When I retired, I was diagnosed with endometriosis, which, came in pretty hard at that time. So I was struggling, not only with, inflammation from my snowboarding and things like that in my body, but also from the inflammation. I suffered from a lot of sort of nausea and just general pain that overtook my entire body. You go to the doctors and they prescribe this and they prescribe that, and you try it and this works and that doesn't, my mum would always say to me, oh, my back hurts. And then she'd say, oh, but it doesn't hurt as much as yours. And I always said, oh, mum, it's not, who can say, because pain's such a subjective thing. You can't say whether one person's feeling more pain than another, whether someone's got a bone hanging out of their arm or somebody doesn't. It's really tough. And so I found all the different doctors, that I had to see, specialists, you name it, and I found that it was just a trial and error, and I speak to lots of friends, ex-athletes or people suffering from endometriosis, and not a single one of us have the same management plan for any of our pain, and so I, after I retired, was in a position where I could try cannabis to see if that would help, with anything in particular for myself, and I found definitely there were certain things that it helped with that I found, the pharmaceuticals and things like that didn't, and I got a lot of reactions sometimes from other pharmaceutical things that I didn't, get from these other things. And I use a lot of other therapies, be it acupuncture or, all sorts of things that aren't necessarily, pushed in the mainstream, but I found that they really, really helped. And as I discussed that with other people in pain, that they said, yes, it did, or they said, no, I hadn't tried that. So I think the important thing is to get the information out there so that people can then make their own decisions as to whether or not that's for them.
Thank you, Holly, for sharing and being so open about your experiences. I know that you have discussed openly about illicit or recreational use of cannabis, and recently you've changed to go down a prescription route. Can you kind of tell us a bit about what it was, why you made those decisions, and what was it like for you as someone trying to get more pain relief and more toolkits, more tools in their toolkit for pain management?
Look, I found it I found it reasonably easy, to be honest. I think I hadn't originally sort of gone down that avenue, because, as you mentioned earlier, things like driving or, what's all the, where do you find all the information? It can be really difficult to find it. And like I said, I mean, if you've been suffering from chronic pain for most of your life, if someone tells you you've got to speak to another doctor to get some different medication, do you know what I mean? My eyes roll so far into the back of my head because it's, and it gets so boring and you just think, oh, sure, just another one of these medications, do you know what I mean? But I found the process really easy to deal with. I found getting the cannabis really easy to deal with. And I really liked the fact that, obviously different to illicit cannabis, that is regulated. Do you know what I mean? So if you take something, the idea is that the next time you take it, it's the same thing instead of, sort of having to go through this guesswork of, what do I do today? Whoops, I've gone too far. Oh no, I didn't take enough. Do you know what I mean? So I found all of that really, really helpful. And once it had sort of been explained to me and I had the information, I found that more information was easier to find.
I can feel a lot of people nodding with your experience around another appointment with a doctor or a healthcare provider. And the costs associated with that and having the discussion again. And for a lot of people, it's really hard just even unpacking the validity of their pain experience and why they're wanting to seek other solutions and treatments, and can be really, really stressful. So thank you for sharing that as well, Holly. Now, Mike, one of the most common questions for our community is, does medicinal cannabis actually work for pain? Can you walk us through what the research tells us and why it also seems so mixed? And, we've got large bodies saying that it doesn't currently have a role in pain management, because of there's not, high quality clinical trials that say it is effective and useful for pain.
To answer that, I'm just going to have to nerd out a little bit and explain how evidence is generated for these kind of things. So we have what's called an evidence pyramid. So at the top of that is something called a meta-analysis, which is where you take a whole bunch of different studies and you kind of smush them together. And just below that are randomized controlled trials. And these are considered to be the gold standard in medicine to be able to tell if an intervention, so if we give something, what are the changes? And we then can be pretty sure that whatever it is that we gave is responsible for those changes. Below that, we've got observational studies, which sometimes are called real-world evidence now. And then below that is kind of expert opinion and case reports and things like that. And so most of the time when we're making healthcare decisions, it's based around these randomized controlled trials or these meta-analyses. And at the moment, we just don't have that evidence in cannabis. And so you might be like, well, why? A couple of big reasons. Firstly, in America, it's impossible to pretty much do any medicinal cannabis research, especially with anything containing THC. So a lot of the big countries are not able to actually do this research in the first place. So that leaves places like Australia to do it, which is fantastic. But the other thing is clinical trials are very, very expensive. And medicinal cannabis isn't really like a pharmaceutical where you can patent it most of the time. So it's challenging to get funding for these clinical trials because they cost a lot of money. And then the final and probably the most important reason, it takes ages to do a clinical trial. So, for an example, we've been running our study on endometriosis now for 18 months, and we are about a third of the way through recruiting. So it's probably going to be at least another couple of years before the study even finishes, and then we analyze it and then we publish it. So there's a big lag between doing studies and getting the results. So when they say there's not high quality evidence, I think that's a fair call. It's being generated, but it's not there yet. What we do have is a mountain of what we call retrospective and self-reported data, which is at the bottom of that evidence pyramid. But I have to say, especially for conditions like endometriosis, it is overwhelming. No matter who we ask, what country we ask, when we ask it, we pretty much get the same results each time, which is people are saying, for a lot of them, it works for me. I'm using it because I wasn't getting enough pain relief from my previous medications, or equally, I was struggling with the side effects from my medications. So those, we know from our research, those are the most common reasons why people consume cannabis, whether it's from the illicit market or from the medical market. And also from another type of data that where people have logged their usage for different things in an app, and we know exactly what products they've taken and how much THC and CBD is there. Again, this is not a randomized controlled trial, but for endometriosis, again, we found that people reported significant reductions in pain, but also, like Holly mentioned, there's so much more than just pain, you know. So many people with endometriosis, for example, have nausea. And so, you know, taking medicinal cannabis can help with the pain, but also the nausea. And sometimes, you know, the medications which are used for endometriosis can actually cause, say, nausea or lack of appetite themselves. So consuming medicinal cannabis, we find that people say that their pain is better, their pelvic pain, their sleep is better, their mental health is better, and their gastrointestinal symptoms are better. So they feel less bloating, less nausea. And so, you know, across the board, whether it's America, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, we're finding the same things over and over. So we don't have high level evidence. Absolutely. It's being generated. But we do know that, as you've already said, Mel, Nicolette, people are using it regardless of the level of evidence because they're getting recommendations from friends, from family, from other people, and they are trying it regardless of what the evidence is. So it's being used in the community, absolutely, for chronic pain.
And that patient-reported experience is legitimate as well. I think it needs a lot of legitimacy behind it. We've been recording about medicinal cannabis for several years, and of course, you know, the National Pain Report is showing that many are citing a benefit, some are citing no benefit, and I think that is a really important thing to take note of, and also why we have these conversations, Mike, to sort of unpack this and demystify it for consumers, so that they do have choice and they do have options when they're going to see their treatment providers as well. Another key issue that's been highlighted in the National Pain Report is that many people are still turning to illicit cannabis to manage their pain. And Holly sort of discussed this and unpacked a couple of those issues of why she went with illicit use rather than prescription use. For our audience, how does this compare to medicinal cannabis in terms of safety, consistency, and outcomes when using either option?
Yeah, absolutely. And Holly's experience is actually really common. You know, our research has shown, again, doesn't matter which country you're in, most people are still consuming it from the illicit market. And a lot of people, we also know, you know, often you hear cannabis is a gateway drug. In this case, yes, but in a good way. So sometimes people have been consuming it recreationally and then have said, oh man, my pain is so much better. And so have actually, while we think of it as recreational usage, it's actually really medical. Anyway, that aside, so medicinal, what's the difference between cannabis and medicinal cannabis? So the cannabis that you might purchase from a friend down the road is grown in probably some uncontrolled conditions. We don't know what they're putting on it to make it grow. And so medicinal cannabis is much more like a pharmaceutical, or it should be. So, you know, you're getting, there's no pest, it's being tested for pesticides, heavy metals. It's being grown and packaged in like a medical type facility. But probably the most important thing, and Holly's already touched on this, is consistency. If I go and buy you know, some cannabis from someone, you know, a friend, I don't really know what's in it. I know there's going to be some THC in there and some CBD, but I really have no idea how much. And the reason that's important is, imagine going to your doctor and they're like, here's your blood pressure medication. I'm not 100% sure if it's going to be the same as the last one. So your blood pressure might get worse, it might get better. Just play around with it until your blood pressure is okay. Like, we would not accept that from our other medicines, and medicinal cannabis is a medicine. So we know, you know, if I purchase product A, which has 14% THC, in the flower, for example, the next time I get my repeat prescription, I should have the same experience. I should be able to take the same amount and I should get the same level of pain relief. Where you don't have that is the risk of obviously underdosing. So, if you've got something that's working really well, you then buy another batch, if you like, and then you're like, wow, actually, that didn't work anywhere near as well. Also, the different ratios of cannabinoids, the different other compounds which are in medicinal cannabis, where there's hundreds of these, cannabinoids and terpenes, which give it the smell and the taste. All of these are also likely to have some therapeutic benefit as well. So we try and, each kind of product has its own fingerprint, if you like. So, it's really important to have, if you're taking it medically, you want consistency, you want safety. But I think overall you want consistency. If you're taking it for a symptom reduction, every time you buy a new batch, you don't want to have to hunt around to figure out how much you have to take. So, and that's obviously putting aside the fact that consuming illicit cannabis is illegal.
Thanks so much for that, Mike. Holly, I just wanted to ask you, is that kind of your experience in illicit use or recreation use? Like there was a change in consistency for you, or how did you find that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think that was one of the main reasons, moved away from it. Because, yeah, it's very true, especially with, things like gummies or anything like that. You don't know if, one day you eat half and you get the good thing, and then the next day you eat half and you don't. So you eat a whole one and then you've gone way too far and you're like, oh, well, geez, and then what do you do once you've written off your day or something, So absolutely, it's that that level of control, which I found really useful, because it's true, with your other medications, they don't say, they do to a certain degree, say take it, but, there's, sort of a limit. Yeah. Whereas, as you say, when you're getting it from your friend down the road, they might say, oh, try half, see how you go. Do you know what I mean? And that's not what the doctor's saying to you when they're, giving you Panadine Ford or, anti-inflammatories or something else. The idea is that it is what it says on the box.
Thanks for that, Holly. And Mike?
Yeah, I just want to add something to what Holly said, is just to be clear, when we talk to people with chronic pain about medicinal cannabis, it's overwhelmingly clear. People do not want the high. They want the relief from pain. I think it's really important to put this out up front. If people are using it recreationally, that they might have different goals. But if they're using it for pain, most of the time, most people don't want to be impaired. They just want relief of the pain. That's, again, why knowing what you're taking is really important, because as Holly's mentioned, you can take a little bit too much. You're not going to die, but you might have a very unproductive day. And so, it is, I think, just because there's so much stigma around cannabis consumption, this idea that, it's just people are just using it medically because they just want to get high. That's not been it's all of the research is so consistent about this. And again, this is where knowing what you're taking is really helpful in making sure that you're, sometimes, I guess, on that line of, not being too impaired, but getting the symptom relief that you want.
Mike, it's such an important point that you brought up, because the stigma for our community is massive, particularly around medicinal cannabis, opioids as well. They all get lumped in that they're potentially drug-seeking people. And I work clinically in chronic pain as well as a pharmacist, and I can tell you the large majority of people that I work with are trying to get some pain relief and some quality back into their life, like Holly has talked about as well today. Mel, we're going to go on to a topic of cost. In the Chronic Pain Australia's National Pain Report in 2024, 46% of people cited that cost is a major barrier to accessing treatment. Medicinal cannabis is a private medicine. It's not listed on the PBS and it's not government subsidised. So what does this mean for the average person, and what kind of costs are we sort of facing if we're looking to trial this?
I love this question, because there is so much rhetoric out there around what things cost and don't cost, what the experience is and isn't, and what's right for me. And to be honest, when people think about cannabis, any cannabis, they think about flower, and flower is the dried bud of the cannabis plant, and that is very common. That's 70% of actually what's prescribed in Australia. So flower absolutely has a place, but there's a lack of awareness around the other formats and certainly formulations, and the cost varies with each. So to give you an idea, flower typically is prescribed in a 10-gram jar. There are a range of different products. There's actually about 1,600 cannabis medicines available in Australia. They are unapproved therapeutic goods. They must be prescribed by a doctor. But across all of those, you've got flower. Now, in typically a 10-gram jar, you're looking at around $120 to $160. Depending on what your doctor recommends, your dosage might be 0.2 of a gram. So that jar for your $120 to $160 will last you a whole month. You might be prescribed a different format. So let's talk about an oil and a CBD oil, which is really typical. So a bottle of quality CBD oil, which is kind of like a 30 ml bottle with the little brown one with the dropper people will be familiar with. They're available. I mean, that's about 15% of the product prescribed in Australia. And that cost is typically closer to around $150. But again, it's 0.2 mil typically to get started. And prescribers always start low and go slow. So it's not like you're going to be coming out and spending $1,000 a month on medicinal cannabis. It really is between you and your doctor, what suits your condition. Do they think it's an appropriate solution for you in concert with the other tools that you're using? And let's start low and go slow and give it a trial. So if we think about other formats, what's become more popular in Australia over the past certainly 18 months is a vape cartridge, a small vape cartridge that connects to a battery. The reason that format is popular is because it's very discreet. So if you're, things that I hear are, but I'm a professional and I don't want people to know I consume cannabis. It's not anybody's business. I don't want to smell like cannabis. I don't want to do the process of going through and rolling up or using a vaporizer. So vapes have become very popular, and they're similar to the oils, around 120 to 150. And there are CBD only vapes that people report, great relief from through the day without being impaired. So it depends on the patient, and it depends on, let's use a chronic pain patient, for example. It depends on their symptom load and what the doctor's going to recommend. It also depends on lifestyle. So that patient, for example, as I've just said, may not want to be impaired or use any THC in the day, even if they are in pain. They're more comfortable to use THC in the evenings and to kind of work with their prescriber to work out what is a good regime. So it can be from, say, $120 a month, depending on the patient and what needs to occur. It could be a few $100s a month. And you have to work with your doctor and have that great patient team partnership. And you say, this is expensive for me. I need something that I can trial that's not going to cost me a lot, because otherwise I won't be able to explore it. The other thing is there are some great compassionate access schemes, and the Australian Medicinal Cannabis Association have a program called Compass, which any cannabis prescriber can use to support that patient to obtain cannabis medicines at a low cost or no cost if they are truly in need. And the other really wonderful way to save money on cannabis medicines, if it is something you want to explore medicinally, is to participate in research. Because when you're participating in research, like the work that I do with Lemire Mission, you aren't paying for clinical care. You aren't paying, for that on-call access to a research team or to a clinic team. And you're certainly getting the medicines discounted, at least as a part of that. Typically around a 20% discount off what would otherwise be charged. But I know Mike has some data on that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. Just speaking here specifically about endometriosis, because that is my area of expertise, if I have one. And so we know for people with endometriosis, they tend to be spending around 300 Australian dollars a month on their medicinal cannabis. And that data is historic, so it might not reflect the current costs, because we asked this question about 18 months ago. So recent price drops might make this different. And most people are spending about $100 to $200 on their initial consultation with a clinic, and then an ongoing cost of around 300 Australian dollars a month. But cost is a major barrier. As you've mentioned, it's not on the PBS. It's not subsidized by most health insurance companies. I think there might be some who are looking at it. But why I'm bringing that up is that we know from our research, 3/4 of people who are using medicinal cannabis tell us that they either need to reduce their dose or they need to use illicit cannabis to top it up because they can't afford it. So cost is a really major issue. And one of the reasons I wanted to point out, one of the things we're aiming for with our research and our clinical trials especially, is if we can generate the evidence that medicinal cannabis is safe and effective, there is an argument for it to be put on the PBS to make it more affordable. And that's one of the big drivers behind the research that we're doing.
It's wonderful, Mike, and thank you, Mel, for articulating that. And cost is a huge challenge for our community. And I think knowing this information going forward of how much out-of-pocket expenses you're thinking about, including maybe your GP, trip to the pharmacy, etc., is really important to start the conversation. I just wanted to ask Mike, what would be a trial period? Say I wanted to start medicinal cannabis and see if it's effective for my pain conditions. How long should I be on that medicine until I can go, yep, it's working for me, or no, it's not? When would I get a response?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it probably depends on what you're taking. So with CBD, we don't see that having usually this immediate pain killing effect. It tends to have more of an anti-inflammatory effect. So for a lot of people with CBD, they might need to take it for several weeks before they notice a difference. And so, if you're taking, say, like a CBD oil, for example, you might need to take it for maybe a month. Because you'll also need to build up to the right dose for you. Like Mel mentioned earlier, one of the things we don't have for medicinal cannabis, unlike normal pharmaceuticals, is a good dosage range for each condition, so we follow this rule: start low, go slow. So it can actually take weeks and weeks to get up to a dose which might be the right one for you, especially when you're taking an oil. If you're taking, say, like a vaporized THC containing flower, you probably will expect to see some pain relief within about 10 minutes. And so it really just depends on the mode of administration. But I think for most people with chronic pain, a trial of, say, 4 to 6 weeks is probably a good start. You do need to give it some time, especially the CBD, to kind of build up and, get that right dose. But
now, Mel, I wanted to ask you a question around access issues. So 27% of our national pain report from survey respondents said that access was a massive challenge. What are the access issues, and how? What's your sort of recommendations on how you could explore this as a treatment option?
Yeah, absolutely. I was a little surprised when I read that data because, we hear a lot about, how easy it is to access now. But as we can see for patients, certainly in the pain community, and that would be reflected across other cohorts, there is a lack of access and an awareness of where to start. So let's start with who can prescribe. So any registered medical practitioner, so a doctor, especially a GP or a specialist, and in some states, nurse practitioners. However, they need to obtain special approvals. Those approvals are not difficult to obtain, but what we're seeing across the medical cohort is there's a little bit of resistance or a lack of appetite to move towards cannabis for many, for all of the reasons you'll imagine. Stigma, burden on healthcare practitioners already. It's just one more thing. I already have solutions I can offer my patients. So unless a potential prescriber is quite driven to come towards cannabis, and that will come from patients requesting most typically, we find that it takes time to change hearts and minds in the medical community, and that's a lot of the work that I do. We have probably by now got around 7% of potential prescribers in Australia prescribing cannabis. So 7% of people who are going to their doctor or nurse practitioner or specialist and saying, I'm interested in exploring cannabis. Is that something we can do? Only 7% are getting an immediate yes. And that's where that issue comes in. And the thing is, for these medical, health professionals, it's really not their fault. This is one more thing. It's not included typically in medical training. The endocannabinoid system was only discovered in the 90s, even though this is a very old medicine, according to history. This is also a very new medicine that's resurging. And how do we fit that into our daily lives when we have 10-minute appointments and all of those things? So there needs to be an understanding when we say healthcare practitioners can be slow to adopt. We need to understand the pressure on those healthcare practitioners as well. So, and it's going to be a perfect storm of research and more information and more education. In an ideal world, any Australian should be able to go to their primary care provider in the community and say, I would like to explore cannabis. And what I would love to see is that doctor, that nurse practitioner say, great, let's have a talk about that. It should be a more common tool in the toolkit. It's just not at this point, but cultural shifts, stronger medical education and webinars exactly like this are really a part of the work to make those shifts, which is really exciting. So the other beautiful way that you can start exploring cannabis is, of course, through research and participating in a research study. Because yes, you're getting the wonderful quality controlled medicines that you all spoke about earlier, as opposed to those which potentially are very risky. You're also getting that beautiful clinical oversight. And that's the thing I wanted to say about what's the difference between cannabis from your neighbour and cannabis from your doctor, is that doctor is caring for you. That doctor is listening to you. They understand your conditions. And they understand any contraindications. There are medications, there are conditions that make people not suitable for exploring medicinal cannabis. And your neighbour who thinks they're doing you a great service just doesn't know and could be causing harm or risk. So there's work to be done for doctors to help them understand, and there's work to be done for patients. I would suggest research is a great option, and we've got some great studies. There's lots of great studies happening. It's a lovely soft entry.
Wow, thank you, Mel. And I had no clue it was only 7% of our health professionals that prescribe medicinal cannabis. So that's a fascinating stat, and you unpacked that really well. Mike, the product has been legal and available for nearly 9 years, yet many people still feel unsure about the rules, and this is state by state. We have different rules as well. So what should consumers know before starting medicinal cannabis, especially around its legal requirements, driving and workplace implications?
Yeah, so this is the major barrier for most people. And also, since we're speaking about research, the major barrier for research is for our endometriosis study, to give you some idea, we've screened 3,500 people, and less than 200 have been eligible, mostly because of the driving aspect. So it's probably important to separate it out. A CBD isolate, which contains no measurable THC, as far as I'm aware, and Mel, please correct me if I'm wrong, there is no issues there in terms of driving. So you're not going to have any problems with driving. You're not going to have any problems in the workplace. The downside is that for many people with chronic pain, CBD isolate is not actually enough. And so then we move to something like a CBD extract, which does have a little bit of THC in it. If you're taking enough of the CBD extract, you're going to get enough of the THC to show up in, these very, very, so the roadside drug testing is very crazily sensitive. So way too sensitive, as a matter of fact, to actually be useful from my point of view, because it's not actually testing for impairment, it's just testing for the presence. So if, say, Holly is having a bad pain day with her endo today and she uses her vaporizer, I'm just in case that's what, like she's vaporizing some THC containing flower. The impairment that Holly feels will be gone by the end of the day. But if she drives in a couple of days and gets picked up for a roadside drug test, she'll test positive, despite the fact she's not impaired. And so therefore, what are we really testing for? So driving is a major issue. In the moment, I believe in Tasmania and Victoria, if you get pulled over and test positive, the magistrate does have discretion in terms of, if you have a valid medicinal cannabis prescription. In other states, it's in New South Wales, for example, it is just illegal to have even with the prescription. There is stuff going on in the courts, but it's a major barrier, understandably, and also in the workplace. If you are an emergency medicine doctor or a nurse, you're probably not okay to have THC in your system, at work for safety reasons. So CBD isolate, no problems at all there for any of these things. It's just the presence of the THC, because THC is the intoxicating compound in medicinal cannabis. And the downside is, like I said, from our research, and also I think anecdotally we hear a lot, there's that for some people CBD works really well, which is fantastic, but for many people they do need that THC for the pain relief. So that's the major impact. And it is also, I just want to point out, one of the most unfair things about medicinal cannabis is medicinal cannabis a medicine? I think it is. So why is it treated differently to other medicines? You mentioned opioids earlier. We know many people with endo and chronic pain in general are put on opioids, despite the evidence is actually suggesting that's not a good idea. They're also often put on benzodiazepines, Valium and things like that for helping with sleep or muscle pain. Both of those, I would not suggest driving on those, but it is actually not going to be picked up on a roadside drug test. So a lot of people we hear, and I personally agree, it's really unfair, that you can be taking your medicine, you can not be impaired, and you can be breaking the law. So until this changes, I think this, from my point of view, this and the stigma around cannabis consumption are the two major barriers for this being an actually viable alternative to many medications. Until this changes, I think this is going to be the major barrier, because understandably, most people need to drive, and I just think that is really, until we kind of resolve those issues, medicinal cannabis is going to be difficult for many people to consume.
Yeah, I'd absolutely echo how frustrating it is for the community, and crazy unfair when we have this as a legal medicine in Australia since 2016, and we still have these restrictions on people. And to my knowledge, it's not verified what the issue is around driving on medicinal cannabis, or if that causes impairment. I don't know if there's been any updates in that space. Mel, have you got?
It's so much more complex than measuring like blood alcohol concentration. So it's such an ongoing conversation. But as of now, there's the most recent change that's occurred to those laws is Victoria granting judges discretion in line with Tasmania.
As we begin to wrap up, I'd love to give each of our panelists a moment to share one final thought. And Holly, what kind of message would you like to give others with pain who are curious about this as a treatment option, and give your wise words of wisdom?
Look, I think it's really important to know what's out there. I've come from an eclectic group of people, and so there's a lot of sort of alternative medicines, things like acupuncture and all sorts of different things that I've tried along the way that I've found have helped. And, not all parts of acupuncture help for me, and not all parts of seeing my GP work for me, not all parts and all of them. But once you put it all together and you work out what works best for you, then I find that you can often find a solution. Whereas if you're just trying to find from one triangle something that's going to work, I find for something that is so subjective like chronic pain, I find it can be really difficult and very frustrating, because it's hard.
And it's so individualized, like you said, Holly. You really need to be your own explorer and your own advocate to find what works. So really important message there. Mike, what's your final message that you want to leave with the audience around this topic?
I would just say that, medicinal cannabis won't work for everybody. And, it's something that, is really important to explore under the guidance of a doctor. And the reason for that is, we haven't covered it earlier, but a well-reported, outcome of medicinal cannabis for chronic pain is what we call the substitution effect, which is where people report reductions in medications being basically once they've started taking medicinal cannabis. And the common one for endo is opioids, and also benzodiazepines, like I mentioned. Now, both of those, I think most people would agree it's probably good to reduce the dose on those because they do have some pretty addictive potentials. But also, it's not necessarily safe to come off those yourself without some supervision. And so, I would say it's really important, if you are consuming cannabis, whether it's illicitly or legally, tell your doctor about it. They need to know to help you manage, if you do want to come off your opioids or your benzos, talk to them about it. So it's really important. It's a medicine. The same way I wouldn't recommend that, you self-medicate with many other things. It's great to do this under the guidance of a doctor. And also just, medicinal cannabis is not a panacea. It's not for everyone. Some people, as Mel has already mentioned, people with a history of psychosis or schizophrenia, for example, something containing THC is probably not a really good idea. People with very high anxiety can also react badly to, THC. So this is, again, have that conversation with, your doctor. Some people are very keen on this idea that medicinal cannabis cannabis is natural, therefore it's completely safe and it can never do any harm. And unfortunately, that's not the case. It has a low side effect profile for many people, which is fantastic. But, it's not just something that we can say, everyone should be trying this. It's going to work for your pain. It's a miracle. But it's worth investigating, and it's worth doing it, in a safe and controlled manner.
Wonderful. Great messaging, Mike. And Mel, you've kind of alluded to a lot of opportunities for people who are interested to participate in research. Can you explain what those opportunities are and how they can get in touch as well?
Absolutely. Thank you. So there are three currently within my portfolio under the Lemire mission. There are 3 studies actively recruiting in Australia. The first one is the Lemire mission study, where we have ethics approval to support up to 1 million Australian cannabis patients. And that particular study is condition agnostic. Anyone can participate, and participating is really simple. It's about filling out a survey once a month and reporting what cannabis medicines you're using, so that we can better create and curate that information to contribute to research, but also for doctors, because those, 93% of potential prescribers are often waiting on, well, how do I do it and what works for what condition? And we're learning. We're on that journey. So that's the Lemire mission, and that you just go to lemiremission.com. Certainly the link will be there. For women, we also have 2 really amazing studies that are active at the moment. One around primary dysmenorrhea, which is period pain, which in fact is my chronic pain condition. So it's one that's close to my heart. And we also have menopause and sleep disturbance and a range of other menopause symptoms. So as well as being, an opportunity for anyone to participate in the Lemire mission, for Australian women across the timeline from age 20 to age 65, we've got you covered, and it's myself and actually Mike Armour who look after those studies. So I would invite anyone to come and have a look. If you've got questions, we're here. It is a call to action because we've done the work to create the research, we've done the work to create the opportunity, and it is hard to recruit.
That's incredible and so exciting that we've got such a massive, large trial happening, and leading the charge is Australia in this space with a lot of our lead researchers. And thank you to Lemire for even pulling together all the funding that was needed for these clinical trials. Would have been an enormous effort. Thank you so much to our amazing panelists today, Holly, Mike and Mel, and particularly for sharing your own lived experience, your insights, honesty and generosity in this discussion. And thank you to our community for joining us. Whether you're exploring options, advocating for better care, or just curious, your voice matters in shaping the future of pain care. This session was proudly sponsored by Lumiere Mission. Please check out their website and is presented as a part of our big event, which is National Pain Week 2025. So take care and let's keep the conversation going.